Hello and welcome at Terra Index. In this video we will look at the Borelog settings. From the project details screen you can find the Borelog function at the bottom left of the screen. It then opens the Borelog page, which is actually the same as the reports page. Now let's select a Borelog file. These can be found at the bottom of the page if you haven't pinned one to My Reports already. Here you'll see the Settings button. Note that this button is only visible if you have Application Manager rights. This is explained in more details in the video about user administration. When we click on this button, we arrive at the following display. On the left, we have different tabs with all the adjustable settings underneath. And on the right, we see a preview of the Borelog. This is very similar to when you generate one single report. Only here, there are many more customization options, and you have the possibility to save your options in the template. Let's start with the first tab, General. Here you can set some basic settings, such as the page format, in A4 or A3 for example, the orientation, the amount of Borlogs to display horizontally and vertically, the scale, and so on. Now let's get into the more interesting part, the labels. The labels represent all the data displayed on the page. Here we make a distinction between page labels and Borelog labels. Page labels are the project details displayed on each page, generally at the top or bottom. Think of information like the project code, the project leader, the address, and so on. While Borelog labels represent Borelog details that are displayed next to each separate Borelog. Here it is common to find the name, the XY coordinates and date. But there are of course many other options. The labels are set in the same way for both cases. If you look for example at the project code, we see a label text. How do we call this label? Project code in this case. Show label to actually display the label on the page. A few settings for the font. Frame, whether we want a frame around the label. Let's switch that on for now. And then with left position and top position you can define where the label will be placed on the page. Here you define the number of pixels to the right of the left page margin and to the bottom of the top margin. Let's make this a little smaller. Now inspect the results by generating a preview. As you can see, the label is placed a bit higher and there is a frame around it. You can also play around with the margin of the data. When it is set to 0, the data will be placed right next to the label text. But let's now assume you want to move it further to the right. Then increase this value and let's see how it works out. As we can see, the frame is now too small and overlaps with the text. So we have to increase the width of the label. If we do that, we get a much better result. And so in this way you have a lot of options to customize the setup of your Borlogs. The same holds for Borelog labels, where we have the measurement point name, location, and so on. However, here the positions are relative to the Borelog itself, not the page. One nice option to mention is the logo field in the page labels. This allows you to add your logo to each page. With the tool button you can upload an image, select it, and now you can play around with the position settings to get it where you want. Another important subject are the Borelog components. Here you can define which components you want to display. For example, here you see the gauging tubes next to each Borelog. If you want to remove those, just uncheck the box, generate the preview, and if all goes well, the gauging tubes will be removed. What else can you tweak? Well, there is a width and spacing option. With the width, you can set the width of the item. Here, for example, the texture is 150 pixels wide. If I change that to 50, you'll see that it becomes much narrower. The spacing options defines how much space there is before the next item. In this case, these are the field samples. If I increase it to 100, you'll see the spacing has increased. There is also the option to show the textures in color or black and white. And you can tweak these options for quite a few components. The next interesting aspect are the layer descriptions. Here you can define what is displayed in the text next to each Borelog. We have described the texture, and here you can determine what is included. And for a few items you can also choose whether to write the full description or use an abbreviated version as a code. It saves some space and allows you to include more information. Then we have the Extra tab. The Extra tab contains a collection of information that you can choose to include in your Borlogs. Here you can set whether to display the water level next to the gauging tubes. But what is also interesting is to include the scale. Here we have the scale shown next to the texture, and you can set whether to display it relative to the reference plane or ground level. You can also include your field samples, that you can display with a different color depending on the analysis results. You can select the standard for the assessment, indicate to display the test result in color, and then these will be included in your Borlogs. Another one that is worth mentioning is the display overlapping field samples next to each other. This means that if you have multiple samples over one section, these will be displayed next to each other instead of overlapping. This can be particularly useful when you have normal samples and mixed samples in the same section. Then we have one last tab left, the Margins tab. Here you can play around with the page and Borelog margins. This will depend on the type of paper format you use, or maybe you use paper sheets that already have a logo on them. Then you can make sure everything gets printed in the right place with these settings. Here it's interesting to look at the Borelog top margin. This determines how much space there is between the Borelog label and the Borelog itself. So if I change this to 300 and generate a preview, you'll see that the Borelog has moved down relative to the label above. So we've gone through all the tabs, and you have seen that there are a lot of options you can tinker with. Have some fun and play around with it. And if there is something you can figure out, you can always call our server's desk so we can look at it together. When everything is said and done, do not forget to click on Save. Only then will all your modifications be registered. And that is how you can customize your Borlogs in TerraIndex. In the next video, we will look at report templates. Thanks for watching, until next time.